Hey, welcome back, brothers and sisters, to another episode of During Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Kitts. Today I want to talk about something that was covered and been covered. The phrase, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it appears multiple times in the Bible. We find it in Exodus 3 and Matthew 22, and it carries deep theological significance. It demonstrates God's ongoing covenant relationship with His people across generations and highlights different aspects of His nature and His plan. Let's break down each of these patriarchs and their unique calling. Then we can explore how they come together and apply to us today. First is Abraham. He's had a call to faith. Who was he? Abraham was called by God to leave his homeland and go to an unknown place, a place he will tell him later. That's Genesis 12. And he's known as the father of faith because he trusted God's promises even when everything seemed impossible. Now, a key lesson we can learn is about faith and obedience. Abraham believed in God's promises, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. An example of that is his wife Sarah, or Sarai, was barren. She couldn't have children, but he was told that he would have the children would outnumber the stars in the sky and the sand of the sea. You can't do that if you don't have kids. But he still hung on to that promise. If God said it was going to happen, it was going to happen. Now, God's role in Abraham's life, God revealed himself as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. When we hear about how God provided a ram as a sacrifice instead of his son Isaac in Genesis 22, how does that apply to us? We are called to trust God, even when we don't see the full picture. We don't know the whole thing. Like Abraham, our faith is credited to us as righteousness, according to Romans 4 and 3. Second, we need to talk about Isaac, the promise and the blessing. Who was he? Isaac was the son of a promise, born miraculously to Sarah in her old age. She was well beyond her childbearing years, it said in Genesis 21. His life was marked by peace and continually, rather than the great struggles that had befell the people before him. The key lesson is receiving and walking in God's blessing. Isaac didn't strive like Abraham, but inherited the promises and he walked in them. Now, God's role in Isaac's life, God provided for Isaac, reaffirming the covenant and the blessing that he had called out abundantly on Isaac's life. How that applies to us, we are heirs to God's promises through the faith in Jesus Christ. And that's Galatians 3:29. Sometimes our role is not to forge a new path, but to faithfully walk in what God has already established. Then third is Jacob, the transformation. Who was Jacob? Jacob started out as a deceiver, tricking his way into receiving his brother Esau's birthright blessing. And that's Genesis 27. However, through wrestling with God in Genesis 32, he was transformed, changed into Israel, who was the father of the 12 tribes. The key lesson is redemption and identity is what happens, you change. Jacob's journey reflects how God refines and transforms us into something that He has called us to be. I just went over how God, when you have an encounter with Him, will change your name to a name that only He knows. There's many examples throughout the Bible that has name changes. Jacob into Israel is one of them, but it's after a encounter with God. Once you have an encounter with God, you're not the old person you was, you're a new person, and He gives you a new name. Now, God's role in Jacob's life, God wrestled with Jacob and changed his name to Israel, symbolizing a shift from self-reliance to a dependency on God. Now, how does that apply to us today? We all have struggles, but God uses them to shape us, to change us, to transform us. Through Christ we are made new, 2 Corinthians 5:17. Just as Jacob was given a new name and a new purpose. How's this all come together? Abraham represents faith, an initial step of believing in God's promises. Isaac represents blessings, the inheritance that comes through faith and believing in God. Jacob represents transformation, the refining process that prepares us for God's purpose. Together, they show the full picture of a Christian walk. One, to believe in God's promises, like Abraham. Second, to receive His blessings through faith, like Isaac. And we're transformed into His image through challenges, like Jacob. When Jesus referred to this phrase in Matthew 22:32, He used it to show that God is the God of the living and not the dead. Now, this means that God is eternal and unchanging. The same God who was with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still with us today. We are part of the same covenant. Through Christ, we are grafted into the blessings of Abraham. We get that confirmation in Galatians 3:14. Our journey with God includes faith, blessings, and transformations. Like the patriarchs, we are to trust, walk in His promises, and then allow Him to shape us. God's plan spans generations. Just as He was faithful to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He will be faithful to us. Well, thank you for joining me on this episode of During Bible Study Podcast. I've been your host, Steve Kitts, and today we covered the phrase, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I know that we've heard that a lot, and I wanted to break that down so you could understand it, how God wanted you to know. So there you go. I love you, and thank you for being part of God's plan, part of the walk that He has called you into. Stand strong, be usable, study His Word, go out there and touch and reach lost souls. In Jesus' holy name, amen. I want to take a minute to talk to you about Buzzsprout. Today is a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new market or a channel, may I suggest that you share your thoughts and your ideas with the world. And it's just so fun to have a talk show. Podcasting is very easy, inexpensive, and a fun way to expand your reach online. Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online and listed in major podcast directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and many more within minutes of finishing each recording. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and a team that they have at Buzzsprout is passionate in helping you succeed. They want you to succeed. Join with over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. Let's go ahead and create something together. God bless you.